There probably aren't a lot of things that can scare a cold-blooded, egomaniacal Russian dictator like Putin, but there are some. COVID-19, for instance. The guy's terrified of it and makes his staff take PCR tests several times a day, every day. Then there's assassins, independent media, democratic elections, and democracy in general. The probability of being overthrown by his own people, and Finland. Wait, what? Finland? Yep. The happiest country in the world with around 75% forest surface and the world's biggest archipelago absolutely terrifies the current head of the Russian Federation. Here's why. Imagine for a moment you're a Russian resident in the port city of St. Petersburg, north of Moscow on the Baltic Sea. It's the year 2023, and you turn on the television to discover that once neutral Finland, your neighbor to the north, is now a part of the NATO alliance. It's a shocking blow, if only because you know exactly what it means for you and your family. Putin has been fuming about Western imperial expansion for months now. And as things have gotten worse in Ukraine, you fear it's only a matter of time before you or someone you know is conscripted and sent to the front lines as cannon fodder. The way the propagandists have been talking about Finland's defection to the West and Russia's Baltic access being restricted by NATO nations, you worry that Ukraine is just the start of a decade of war that will inevitably end on your doorstep. Finland is, after all, less than 125 miles from St. Petersburg, well within range of Western long-range guided missiles now being deployed over the border. You get goosebumps as a chill runs down your spine. The future, as long as Putin is in power, looks very dark indeed. It is a fitting twist of fate that the man who set out to reduce Ukraine to a puppet state and create a greater buffer between Russia and NATO has now induced long-neutral Scandinavian countries to apply, and in Finland's case, join the NATO alliance, and adding insult to injury, double its physical border with Europe. During the Cold War, neutral Finland had to be in line with Russia. Fearful of reprisal and repression, it will do so no longer. Now bolstered by its Western allies, Finland offers undeniable physical, material, and technological benefits to NATO, and that should scare Putin. If the invasion of Ukraine tells us one thing about Putin, it's that he cannot conscience the prospect of ex-Soviet satellites drifting into Western orbit. Back in 2014, when the war in Ukraine really started, Ukraine was already on this path. A presidential coup had deposed its leader, and quickly Ukraine's very constitution was amended to include a clause saying that the country would immediately strive to meet qualifications for eventual NATO membership. There's a reason for Putin's paranoia. Russia hasn't exactly been on the happy side of history for much of its past. European invaders have picked Russia apart, or tried to at least, at various times, from Napoleon's aborted invasion in 1812 to grueling battles with Germany in both world wars. Putin's heroes, the post-1945 leaders he so desperately seeks to emulate, laid down a strict national security policy during the Cold War that eventually became Soviet doctrine. Rather than sit idly while countries on its frontiers flirted with Western influence, Russia would incorporate them into its own ideological bloc, spanning Eastern Europe. The buffer it created with the Warsaw Pact is still cited by Putin and his propagandists as necessary for Russian independence. Without it, Russia allegedly becomes susceptible to Western invasion. And if you can't see the irony there, you won't see it anywhere. The geography of the Russian frontier plays an important role in this strategic outlook, and is thus relevant to our discussion today. Eastern Europe offers far fewer natural defensive barriers than elsewhere, like say the mountainous borders between Austria and Italy. As industrialization transformed the face of war in the 20th century, Russia had to reckon with the advent of modern, mechanized forces and armor. In World War II, German advances over the Eurasian steppes covered dozens, even hundreds of miles a day, stemmed only at a massive cost to Soviet manpower pools. Russia has benefited from Finnish neutrality since 1945 for many reasons, but paramount among them is the idea that it simply did not have to worry about the hostilities spilling out across its massive border in a hypothetical confrontation with NATO. That until today would most likely be confined to a small sliver of Baltic territory. No longer. When Finland officially joined NATO in 2023, Russia's border with the alliance effectively doubled. It now has 830 miles of difficult-to-patrol tundra, swamps, forests, and flatlands to worry about. Putin's defensive calculus was altered overnight. He may pretend Finland's accession doesn't bother him, but it does, As Putin told the Finnish Prime Minister in 2022, "When we look across the border now, we see a Finn on the other side. If Finland joins NATO, we will see an enemy." Strategically, Russia simply lacks the troops to handle this frontier, since they've deployed most of their available forces in Ukraine. It's a bear of a problem to deal with, one that simultaneously shrinks Putin's sphere of influence and makes his imperial ambition even harder to achieve. NATO 1, Russia 0. The Kremlin's time-tested tactic to place the onus of aggression on its enemies is one it will continue using, portraying NATO enlargement as the cause of its actions, not the consequence. These rhetorical gymnastics are predictable enough. Now that Finland has joined NATO, democratically, we should note, something the Kremlin will not, Putin can use it as the cornerstone of his hateful crusade in Ukraine, a symptom of broader Western challenges to Russian interests everywhere. Putin has sworn that there will be consequences from Finnish and Swedish membership. That threat just doesn't cause the same alarm bells to ring today as it might have when it was issued, but NATO will still take it seriously. Just because Russia may lack the military means to make Finland pay, doesn't mean it will stop talking about it anytime soon. The same goes for Finland. These two countries have a past, and let's just say they could never really play nice. You see, there is real enmity between both countries, one that is historically rooted in shared 20th century experiences. Russo-Finnish animosity originated in Finland's membership as part of the Russian Empire until its independence in 1917, when the Tsarist government collapsed. Throughout the 1920s, Finland tried to retain its neutrality, backing out of a last-minute defense alliance with Poland, Latvia and Lithuania at the last minute. In 1932, the Soviets tried to quell Finnish fears by signing their own non-aggression pact. Little did Finland know the Soviets would dole out non-aggression pacts like hotcakes in the coming conflict, treating bilateral promises as loose suggestions rather than binding rules. During World War II, tensions between the Soviet Union and Finland exploded once more when the Soviets signaled their expansionist aims by signing yet another non-aggression pact, this time with Nazi Germany in August 1939. This was the one that stunned the world, starting a global war that would consume the globe. As a result, the sovereign state of Poland ceased to exist, and Soviet leaders set their sights on the next target, the Karelian Isthmus and the border of Finland, just west of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. It didn't take much by way of negotiation for the Soviets to launch an armored blitz over the Finnish border on November 30th, 1939, kickstarting the Russo-Finnish War, or Winter War. The Finnish response to an invasion of 1 million men is the stuff of legend, one whose indomitable courage and resilience have been likened to Ukrainian resolve in its existential crisis against Russia today. As winter set on the Finnish frontier, plucky Finnish ski troops offered stout resistance, inflicting massive casualties on the bogged-down Red Army. Ultimately, though the Finns, lacking any Western assistance whatsoever from Britain and France, proved unable to stop the Soviets from reaching Vyborg in 1940. The invasion taught Soviet leaders it could neither conquer nor govern a territory that size with the forces at hand. The Winter War resulted in Finnish territorial losses, but the Finns avoided a worse fate. It would take a Machiavellian alliance with Germany to push the Soviets out in 1941, and an armistice in 1944 to forever seal Finland's rancor towards its aggressive neighbor. Finland's strict policy of neutrality it had held since 1945 changed overnight with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, Finland has simply had enough. Its armed forces stand ready to take up arms with their NATO counterparts to deter any future Russian threat, recognizing, as we all should, that over the long term, Russia will reconstitute its forces to adapt its force posture to NATO's new Scandinavian presence from the Baltic to the Arctic. Some are calling Finland's NATO membership the biggest development in European security since the remilitarization of Germany in 1955, when Germany came into NATO as a remilitarized state after the Second World War. This begs the question of why. What does Finland offer NATO in terms of immediate military capacity that other states might not? The first is proximity. NATO is now within touching distance of the strategically important Kola Peninsula in Russia's far north and its second largest city, St. Petersburg, on the Baltic Sea coast. The Kola Peninsula, in case you don't know, has been described by the Center for Strategic and International Studies as the crux of Russia's military establishment in the Western Arctic, whose air and maritime capabilities are essential to Russia's homeland defense, Arctic dominance, and global power. Its Severomorsk 1 airbase, Gadzhievo submarine base, and Okolnaya submarine support base on the peninsula provide Russia with operational readiness in the Arctic, where it can deploy SLBM, ICBM, and electronic warfare assets to defend its positions at a moment's notice. Russia's aggression thus far has resulted in a greater concentration of NATO forces on its Baltic border, a trend it can expect to see continue further north if it continues behaving badly in the geopolitical realm. Starting in 2017, NATO deployed 4 multinational battle groups to the region, one in Estonia, one in Latvia, one in Lithuania, and one in Poland. Each contains about a battalion's worth of forces, just over 1,000 soldiers, together with their equipment, tanks, tactical armored vehicles, a headquarters company, logistics infrastructure, and everything else they would need to fight. NATO cycles new forces through each battle group on a rotational basis. After the 2022 invasion, NATO members agreed to deploy 4 additional battle groups to the states adjoining Ukraine, a safeguard in case the conflict spilled over into NATO territory. Collectively, the establishment of these 4 units constituted NATO's biggest regional reinforcement in over a generation. Fortunately, it has not yet. But as of today, NATO has deployed multinational battle groups to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, extending its defensive front with Russia from the Black Sea to the Baltic. Finland's membership takes NATO's forward presence all the way north to the Arctic Sea. NATO's multinational battle groups are combined arms formations, meaning they employ infantry, armor, artillery, and air power in tandem to achieve their objectives. These unique units are extremely mobile, adaptable, and flexible, trained for an array of threats and combat scenarios. The headquarters for each battle group is integrated, meaning each nation is represented at the command post. Together, they bring unique capabilities to the table in order to bolster collective defense. According to one NATO official, these flexible units are mutually supporting and, most importantly, send a message that we're here, we're ready, and we can respond to any aggression. It's now time to get down to brass tacks. What does Finland offer NATO? Finland has a relatively small peacetime military, ranked 51 out of 145 countries by the annual Global Firepower Review. It spends about $6 billion annually on its standing armed forces. The Finnish army, the country's largest branch and one devoted to the defense of the nation, has a cohort of around 23,000 active duty soldiers on its rolls, including active duty professionals and conscripts. This may not seem like much, but it has a reserve potential of 900,000 from which it can draw 280,000 well-equipped soldiers in times of crisis, 3 times more than the British Army can field. These are subject to mandatory military service and regular training exercises, meaning its reserves are also prepared well. In terms of armored vehicles, Finland's primary tank platform is the highly effective German-produced Leopard 2A4 and 2A6 tanks, of which Finland boasts somewhere in the region of 200, 100 acquired from the Netherlands. 179 of these are said to be field-ready. It recently donated 3 Leopards to Ukraine. Apart from its tank force, Finland fields an assortment of infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, with over 200 of the former and 1,000 of the latter. One of Finland's greatest strengths is its army artillery, considered by some to be the largest and best equipped Europe has to offer. Among more than 900 artillery pieces, it uses the Korean K9 Thunder self-propelled howitzer, the 155 K98 towed howitzer, and M270 multiple launch rocket system, or MLRS, built by the United States. It also has over 700 heavy mortars, 18 Amos self-propelled mortars, 34 2S1 Gvozdika self-propelled howitzers, 471 light howitzers, and 76 130mm field guns. This is a lot of firepower, part of Finland's plan to have the most firepower in Europe by some margin. This service makes use of counter-battery radars to locate the position of enemy artillery batteries, sometimes giving Finnish troops enough alert to bug out before they are struck. Its wheeled counterparts to the devastating American HIMARS systems have already been wreaking havoc on Russian forces in Ukraine. It has been said that the Finnish artillery has more artillery firepower than the combined militaries of Poland, Germany, Norway, and Sweden can muster. The country offers one of the premier artillery firing training areas in the world, Rovajärvi in northern Finland. One comment on an article covering Finland's artillery capabilities stuck out. As someone who did his military service in a forward observer team, the commenter notes, "I am very jealous of Finnish artillery. Even if a lot of systems are old, quantity has a quality all of its own, and that goes double for artillery." The Wilson Center has noted that one of Finland's assets is its well-equipped civilian defense infrastructure, which can be rapidly mobilized to assist in times of crisis or war. This is called the Civilian Total Defense, an organization that would rush to ensure the nation has enough food, fuel reserves, bomb shelters, and protection for 6 months in the event of an attack. This, as you might expect, was created as a direct consequence of repelling the Soviet Union's full-scale invasion in the 1940s, and the country's strategic stockpiles showed their utility when Finland tapped into them during the COVID-19 pandemic. Finland is a technologically advanced nation with a host of industrial-grade IT capabilities, including 5G communications and cybersecurity. This means that Finland's membership automatically conferred NATO with Nokia's entire regional network of 5G infrastructure, a major boom in an era of increasing cyber competition. Finland, relative to many other countries, is resilient to digital attacks, currently ranked 11th in the Cybersecurity Index. It is a telecommunications and intelligence powerhouse, which NATO will reap the rewards from for years to come. Finland's accession to NATO has essentially turned the once contested Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. All of its coastal states are now a part of NATO. If Sweden can follow in Finland's footsteps, which many are optimistic it can, for the first time since the abolition of the Kalmar Union in 1523, the Wilson Center study observes, all the Nordics will be members of the same military alliance. From a military strategy perspective, the additional geographical depth that Finland and Sweden create for regional defense is extremely valuable for all the Nordic countries, as well as for the Baltics. The extension of NATO firepower extends to other domains. Finland has a fleet of 55 US-made Fa-18 Hornets, fully equipped with an arsenal of American precision-guided munitions, among them the AIM-9 Sidewinder and the AGM-158 JASSM air-to-ground cruise missile. In 2022, Finland announced it will station 64 newly acquired F-35 stealth fighters in Lapland starting in 2026. These will be entirely operational by 2030. Their presence makes them interoperable with NATO's existing Baltic Sea air defense missions, and we predict NATO will further extend these missions into Finland on the basis of its existing Baltic air policing operation. In terms of naval power, Finland has the 12th largest navy in the world, with a fleet including 8 missile boats and 10 minesweepers that will come in handy as part of NATO task forces operating within the Baltic. Fortunately for NATO, Finland already spends more than 2% of its GDP on defense, a number that will only rise now that it has become a bulwark of Western security. Finland is not one to shirk its defense responsibilities. Combining its artillery with highly specialized mobile light infantry units, it will wreak havoc on a much larger invading force and make its ancestors proud. By now, we're pretty sure we've made our point. Finland is a military power not to be messed with. What will Putin do? It's unclear whether Russia has the strategic or economic bandwidth to adequately deal with the security complications posed by Finland's NATO membership. Even without NATO, Finland would pose a serious adversary. NATO has military bases throughout Europe. It still must secure Finnish political agreement to permanently base its forces on the Russian border. But NATO will increasingly be looking to simulate the harsh conditions of Northern Europe in its wargaming exercises. Finland has been rehearsing and training its forces to operate in this environment for decades. Now, at the minimum, it will teach allied forces to do the same. Russia's strategic conundrum is enormous. If it had sat back for a decade or more, there's a chance NATO would have dissolved on its own, its internal unity torn asunder by petty politics and an overall lack of purpose. Now Russia will have to make a choice on how to engage in the Baltic-Arctic region. It will likely do what it always has, resort to grey zone tactics to undermine NATO's position. This hybrid spectrum includes attacks on infrastructure like undersea cables, pipelines, and oil and gas fields, or targeted assassinations, sponsored acts of terrorism, and cyber attacks. It will always fall back on its beloved nuclear arsenal, saber-rattling where it needs to project its rapidly diminishing strength. The long bottom line is that Russia can't do much until it pulls out of Ukraine. As the author of a recent Finnish defense report concludes, while Russia will likely try to beef up its forces near Finland in the near future, these won't come anywhere near Cold War levels. Due to the losses Russia has suffered in Ukraine and the slowness of establishing new forces, the report concludes, it is likely that there will be no significant increase in military power in Finland's immediate neighborhood before the 2030s. And that should give Putin great pause. But will it? What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.